In May of 2023, representatives met in the Saudi Arabian city of Jeddah. On one side, the Rapid Security Forces, or RSF, a paramilitary group born from the ashes of Janjaweed militias and led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, the deputy head of Sudan's Sovereign Council. On the other, the Sudanese armed forces and their leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, serves as the country's transitional ruler. The topic for discussion? A ceasefire that would allow much needed aid to reach the country's civilian population. After nearly a month of fighting, at least 750 people lie dead, including civilians. Those fleeing the conflict zone, ripped from their homes and livelihoods by the fighting, number in the thousands. In Jeddah, an agreement of sorts was reached, with both sides nominally agreeing to protect civilians, but the limits of this agreement were very clear. This is not a ceasefire, said a US official who witnessed the negotiations. Back in Sudan, the situation remains dire. The domestic healthcare system is on its knees, with volunteers staffing social media helplines in a desperate effort to help those who cannot reach the treatment centers. Aid workers, doctors, and volunteers are being targeted, threatened, and held by warring factions. Some have even been killed. And as foreign countries scrambled to get their citizens out of Sudan, it was the Sudanese population who were left with nowhere to go, wondering if they would live to see the end of their torment. What has brought us to this point? Why is the nation of Sudan, the third largest on the African continent, being plunged into conflict yet again after generation upon generation of warfare and bloodshed? In this episode of Untangling Africa, we're going to be charting the tragic story of Sudan and her people and questioning what the future holds. More than 5 millennia ago, before the rise of the first Egyptian dynasties, one of the earliest states on the planet was forming. This was Lower Nubia, in what is now Sudan, and it was here that archaeologists found burial sites of ancient rulers and evidence of a functioning government and society. For more than 1,000 years, Lower Nubia and Kush in the northern region went through cycle after cycle of golden age and disaster, existing sometimes in fractious peace, other times in all-out war with their powerful neighbor Egypt to the north. It is Egypt that has been written into the history books in the first place, becoming by far the most famous of the early North African civilizations. But the emergence of Nubia remains a key milestone in the history of human development, identity, and society. Like Egypt, Nubia and Kush benefited from their geographical location along the banks of the Nile. The Great River provided transport, supported agriculture, and even formed the basis for cultural and spiritual belief and early scientific understanding. And, like Egypt, Nubia and Kush would become victims of this prominent position too. As centuries stretched into millennia, the region found itself embattled and conquered time and time again by the Egyptians themselves, by Arabic armies, by the Ottomans, and by the British. The word Sudan emerges first in the medieval period and is itself an example of how colonial and invading forces have influenced the landscape and its people. Derived from Bilad al-Sudan, an Arabic term meaning land of the blacks, the name, which has become synonymous with this part of the world, is not an indigenous word at all. Influenced both by the Islamic world and the Christian world and assailed from the north, east, and south, the Sudanese endured centuries of strife and tumult before Islam became the dominant cultural force. In 1820, the next major political force to control Sudan rose to prominence. The Ottoman Empire captured Khartoum and would rule for the next 60 years. The Viceroy of Egypt would appoint General Charles Gordon in 1874 to pacify the region of South Sudan and seek to extend the power of the Khedive, bringing Sudan and her people under the imperial yoke. After Ismail Pasha was sent to exile, Gordon left, but he wouldn't stay gone for long. In 1882, the British invaded Egypt to prevent failure of the nation and to ostensibly protect British influence in the region. However, this meant that the Nile needed to be protected at all costs. Sudan was again in the crosshairs, but the Sudanese proved capable of fierce resistance, refusing to be subjugated by the brash and arrogant Gordon. The general would pay for his attitude with his life, and with the lives of his men when they were massacred at Khartoum in 1885. Gordon's errors in judgment did not spell the end of colonial influence in the region. Less than 6 months after the victory in Khartoum, the leader of Sudan, the Mahdi Muhammad Ahmad, was dead. His successor, the Khalifa Abd Allah, presided over several years of famine at home and disaster on the battlefield before his autocratic government began to turn things around in the early 1890s. By this point, however, Sudan was very much in the sights of European colonists. The British negotiated terms with the Italians and the Germans, but could not achieve the same diplomatic success with the French. With a new sense of urgency, the British made fresh incursions into Sudan, and the region began almost 6 decades as imperial subjects. On January 1st, 1956, Sudan declared independence from the joint Anglo-Egyptian government that had ruled over the country since the end of the previous century. But what should have been a new dawn for Sudan turned sour before it had even got off the ground. The first movements toward independence had begun decades earlier after growing nationalist sentiment threatened to set Sudan aflame. In 1921, Ali Abd al-Latif founded the United Tribes Society, followed 3 years later by the White Flag League, an organization with the aim of expelling British colonial forces. After the assassination of the Governor-General in Egypt in 1924, the British forces brutally put down a Sudanese rebellion and maintained their grip on power until after the Second World War. But by the late 1940s, a new political system was emerging in Sudan. Sudanese politicians formed parties with a view towards self-governance and autonomy, but these parties had very different views of what this autonomy might mean. There was the militant political wing, which turned toward Egypt and a union with their neighbours to the north outside of British control. And there were the moderates, who formed their own party with the intention of working with the British in a managed transition to independence. The differing approaches of the two parties split the Sudanese people, and the divisions that would later rip the country apart were already beginning to form. The Egyptian government signed an agreement with the British to grant Sudan self-governance within 3 years. This agreement was followed by the national elections later in the year, and the Egyptians, encouraged by his pledges of unity of the Nile Valley and a close relationship with Egypt, backed Ismail al-Azari and his National Unionist Party, or NUP. The NUP won at the polls, dismaying both the British and the more moderate Amma Party, but Egypt would be dismayed too. Al-Azari, eager to avoid a civil conflict within his divided nation, dropped the idea of a union with Egypt. By 1956, Sudan would be a fully independent nation. Al-Azari's efforts were in vain. As independence was declared on New Year's Day, fighting was already underway in the south of the country. The First Sudanese Civil War had already begun, and the fledgling nation was born to a backdrop of bloodshed and terror. During the colonial period, the Anglo-Egyptian condominium had sought to stabilize the country by implementing 2 different administrations, one in the Arab-dominated Islamic north and another in the Christian, African-leaning south. As the British dismantled their colonial structures in Sudan, they failed to recognize this north-south divide. It proved to be a fatal failure. In 1955, appalled by the idea of a consolidation of power in Khartoum, troops in South Sudan mutinied. In the towns of Taurit, Yet, Juba, and Maridi, each home to a military garrison, rebels made their dissent known. Unable to resist the power of troops from the north, the rebels were swiftly overcome but took to the surrounding countryside to continue the fight. While posing little threat to the new government in the north, The units would prove a thorn in the side of al-Azhari's new regime, and a military build-up began in South Sudan. While guerrilla troops coalesced in rural areas to the south, the government in the north had other problems to contend with. The NUP had been swept to power in democratic elections, but this power was vulnerable, and the weight of tradition proved far heavier than British important ideals of liberal democracy. A coup in 1958 saw General Ibrahim Aboud seize power, and Sudan lurched rapidly toward authoritarianism. Political parties and assemblies were outlawed, and the military-backed government began a program of national unification, spreading Arab and Islamic influence into the south. But by this point, the mutineers of 1955 were a bit more than just a thorn in the side. What had once been disparate groups of rebels found allies in the student secessionist movement in the south, and the Anya Nya group was formed. Far more focused and far better organized, the Anya Nya were able to wage a full-scale civil war against the forces of Khartoum beginning in 1962. Perhaps the full might of the Sudanese military could have shattered this rebellion, but protests, uprising, and disagreements in the north proved too great a distraction. People took to the streets to voice their anger at the regime, while a growing leftist influence split the armed forces. A brief civilian coalition under Mohammed Ahmad Mahjoub was created in mid-1965 to attempt to solve some of the issues of representation. However, the same issues of factional disputes reared their heads, and in the end, a coup would again rock the young nation. A new leader would again emerge from the Sudanese armed forces to seize the government in 1969. A group of officers led by Hafar Mohammed el-Namiri would take power in May of that year. A right-wing insurgency threatened the government of el-Namiri but was put down. A Marxist coup in 1970 was briefly successful but was overturned, and its leaders executed by el-Namiri. By the beginning of the new decade, Sudan had already faced 15 years of chaos and conflict. Hundreds of thousands lay dead, and much of the population to the south had been displaced, driven out of their homes by fighting and by the government's heavy-handed attempts at suppression. And the First Sudanese Civil War was still not yet over. In 1971, the Anya Nya movement took on a new name. The South Sudanese Liberation Movement, or SSLM, was better equipped, better organized, and better positioned to strike at the forces of the north than anything that had gone before. The SSLM could not defeat the government's forces outright, but they could grind the conflict to a stalemate and drive them to the negotiating table. Finally, in 1972, after 17 years of war and around 500,000 dead, the two sides signed the Addis Ababa Agreement, effectively bringing an end to the conflict and giving autonomy to South Sudan. The agreement appeared to be a huge success for both sides. South Sudan would remain part of Sudan, but would be permitted a separate legislature and would gain the right to self-administration. The soldiers of the SSLM, including those who'd fought with the Anya Nya for almost 2 decades, would be integrated into a pan-Sudanese military and security forces. Without the constant drain of civil war on government coffers, the entire nation could begin a process of economic development. For his part in the negotiations, el-Namiri, now recognized as leader of Sudan, won significant international acclaim. In the end, however, the agreement that promised so much actually delivered very little. Despite being granted autonomy, the population of South Sudan found themselves increasingly marginalized by the government in Khartoum. The agreed upon sharing of power and distribution of resources were only temporary, and a failure to implement the articles of the Addis Ababa Agreement led to increasing disharmony in a country that had only just emerged from a bloody civil war. But there was peace, or relative peace anyway. At the very least, the people of South Sudan could feel safe and secure in their homes. After a roller coaster of elections, coups, and dramatic shifts in power, President Hafar Nimeri represented something a little different. Though he'd emerged during the chaos and tumult of the 1960s, his strongman tactics had turned Nimiri into something of a constant, a leader who was sticking around. Perhaps sensing that his erosion of South Sudanese autonomy was proving successful, the president grew increasingly confident in his abilities as a head of state. And in 1983, he made a decision that would put Sudan back on the road to civil war. He declared Sudan, from north to south, an Islamic state under Sharia law. History is rarely simple. While imposing Islamic Sharia law on the largely non-Islamic South Sudan sent shockwaves through the region, there were many other factors at play here. The disharmony that grew throughout the 1970s over the oil resources and repeated infringements of South Sudanese autonomy had reached dangerous levels by the beginning of the 1980s. Sharia law and the state of emergency that followed pushed the situation to the brink of disaster, but it was the termination of the Addis Ababa agreement in June 1983 that tipped it over the edge. Aware that his decision-making was likely to be unpopular, Nimiri used the state of emergency to crush dissenting voices. Even Arab Muslim Sudanese citizens who made their dismay known were silenced, and the president's rival, Sadiq al-Mahdi, a descendant of Ahmad Mohammed who had brought about the end of General Gordon in 1885, was placed under house arrest. Criminals and non-Muslim dissenters were subject to even worse treatment, with punitive amputations and public flogging common in the first year of the war, until the state of emergency was lifted in September 1984. In the south, John Garang formed the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or the SPLA, and began the resistance. The SPLA's aim was not another treaty that could be flouted and ignored, but total independence for South Sudan. Foreign weaponry accelerated the conflict. The Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China had flooded the country with weapons throughout the 1970s, while the Americans, keen to counterbalance arms deals from a communist bloc, scrambled to do the same thing. Driven along political, cultural, ethnic, and religious grounds, the pressure cooker of Sudan was now awash with guns, and lots of them. By 1985, the civilian population in Khartoum was feeling the effects of war. Food and fuel supplies were exhausted, and inflation crippled the economy. That spring, the people took to the streets in huge demonstrations, but President Nimiri was nowhere to be found. During the president's absence, buoyed by the shifting tide of public opinion, a group of senior military officials mounted yet another coup, ending Nimiri's ambitions to create an Islamic state, but failing to help the implementation of Sharia law. An interim civilian government served for a year until elections were called the following April. Sadiq al-Mahdi, freed from house arrest, became Prime Minister of the new coalition government, with the long-standing Amma party at its head. But another tried democracy did not end the war and did not bring the economy under control. Inflation continued, as did the demonstrations. The bloodshed continued too, reaching new levels of ferocity. In 1989, exasperated with al-Mahdi's inaction, the army threatened the Prime Minister with another coup. He bowed to their demands, but on June 30th, a junta of 15 officers seized power anyway. General al-Bashir seized the presidency and began another phase of autocratic rule. As politicians and generals locked horns in Khartoum, John Garang and his SPLA were making gains in the south. By the early 1990s, the SPLA controlled large swaths of territory in the southern provinces, but not everyone in South Sudan agreed with Colonel Garang's leadership. A new rebel faction, the Nasir faction, emerged, and attempts were made to oust Garang as the head of the rebel forces. The 1990s added an international element to the struggle. Osama bin Laden brought his al-Qaeda group to Sudan in 1991, injecting cash into the Sudanese economy and finding a suitable base for his terror attacks. The arrival of al-Qaeda and the Sudanese support for Iraq during the Gulf War saw the country isolated by the West. 2 years later, neighboring countries Eritrea, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya sought to bring an end to the conflict, eventually drafting a preliminary peace settlement in 1994. The government in Khartoum eventually signed the agreement in 1997 after a humbling defeat to the SPLA on the battlefield, but the agreement brought the two sides no closer to peace. In January 2005, the rebel groups in the south and the government of Sudan signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, or the CPA, bringing an end to a war that had lasted more than 2 decades and claimed more than 2 million lives. The CPA came after a series of incremental milestones in the early 2000s, internationally brokered agreements that brought the region ever closer to peace. The comprehensive agreement was designed to tie all of these milestones together and bring lasting accord. Al-Bashir would continue as president of the government of Sudan, with John Garang as the nation's first vice president, as well as the president of a semi-autonomous government in the south. Garang would serve this role for only a few weeks before he was killed in a plane crash of July that year. Another high-ranking SPLM figure, Salva Kiir Mayardit, would take over as both VP and as semi-autonomous president of South Sudan. Along with a degree of devolution of power from north to south, other sensitive factors were taken into account. First on the agenda, religion. It was agreed that Sharia law would still stand, but would only apply to the country's Muslim population, a compromise that both sides could accept. Next, geopolitics. The border regions of Sudan and South Sudan were of particular concern, with thousands of citizens who had supported the southern cause and even fought on the side of the south, now possibly at the mercy of the government in Khartoum. Under the CPA, a system of joint administration was implemented in these regions, protecting the safety and security of these precarious communities in a new, forward-looking Sudan. But it was another provision that would offer the biggest hope, both to the people of the south, eager for independence, and those in the north, sick of war. The promise of a referendum in 2011. And so, 6 years after the CPA brought an end to the Second Sudanese Civil War, the people of South Sudan went to the polls to mark their ballots on the question of independence. A new nation, administered from the southern capital of Juba, was born. Time and time again in Sudan, glimmers of hope unfold against the backdrop of suffering. As the civil war drew to a close, another conflict was raging in the west of the country, one that would become synonymous with the very worst of human suffering and misery, the Darfur conflict. Up until 2003, it was the struggle of non-Arabs in South Sudan against the Central Islamic government in Khartoum that formed the foundation for Sudan's bloody modern history. But in the western region of Darfur, non-Muslim groups felt that their own voices were being sidelined. Rebel groups in Darfur began their own insurrection, incensed at the Khartoum government's high-handed attitude to their plight. The Sudanese government, already overstretched and facing international condemnation after 20 years of civil war, opted for an unconventional approach. They would not send their own troops, but would instead arm and support local Arab militias. These militias, collectively known as the Janjaweed, would become part of the global lexicon as the world looked on, appalled by, but not truly comprehending, the suffering in the west of Sudan. As Darfur descended into irregular warfare, Janjaweed militias pitted against similarly informal rebel groups, a humanitarian disaster erupted. Aid agencies couldn't reach those in need, and hundreds of thousands of civilians lost their lives in a maelstrom of fighting and famine. Failed ceasefires and a slow response from the UN, and even an International Criminal Court arrest warrant for President Bashir on charges of genocide did little to ease the situation. Fighting in Darfur, along with clashes in South Kordofan and Blue Nile along the border with South Sudan, continued until 2020, when another comprehensive peace agreement brought this latest chapter of suffering to a close. Omar al-Bashir's 30-year presidency is over. In 2019, after widespread demonstrations against his rule, he was deposed by a coup and arrested on corruption charges. The Janjaweed are gone too, at least officially. In fact, the DNA of these militias is still present in Sudan, forming the core of the RSF forces currently doing battle with the troops of the transitional government. Sudan's history stretches back thousands of years to the dawn of human civilization. For today's Sudanese civilians who have spent their entire lives in a perpetual state of war, their own experience of suffering and death must feel almost as long-standing as this. Even if the RSF and the Sudanese military can reach an accord, even if conflict were to end tomorrow and a new period of peace were to begin, the future of Sudan is uncertain. Decades of political strife and armed struggle have shattered the country's infrastructure and economy. Disagreement and disharmony along ethnic, religious, and political lines still divide Sudan. The humanitarian crises in Darfur and elsewhere in the nation remain unresolved. It will take an enormous reversal of fortunes and an immense concerted effort to bring this ancient land back up from its knees. But what do you think? Where do the roots of the latest conflict in Sudan begin? What comes next for the country and her people? Let us know in the comments section below, and stay tuned for the next installment of our Untangling Africa series.